More hard-hitting comedy from Mark Thomas, delivering water where it's needed.
We've just got a tank of water for you. It's a gift for the people of Ethiopia. We've also got a single, they've made a benefit single for you.
And down at the burger bar...
Do you want to see Ronald? They're clowns, I want them to get a Happy Meal. You put your trousers on, I can't believe this.
You can't afford to be seen without it. The Mark Thomas comedy product, Friday at 10:30 on 4.
The Usual Suspects, the thriller that blew away the critics, is available on video. The Usual Suspects. Rent it now.
Are you Mr. Harry Caution, 64 Chetwynd Road? I have to inform you I am the Grim Reaper, and I have come for you.
I don't believe it.
Look, I'll have you know I take my peeping very seriously.
Lucky old me.
Boy, come here.
You get your money straight away.
Brilliant.
With National Lottery Instants. Forget it all for an instance.
There are two reasons why I like Kellogg's Fruit and Fibre. One, they use only the finest ingredients. And two, it's good for my body. So I feel like this, and this. And that's all before I go to work.
Kellogg's Fruit and Fibre. You'll feel as good as it tastes.
If your idea of a typical estate car is something that resembles a wardrobe on wheels, take a look at the new Citroen Xandia Estate. And if you're wondering what it's like flat out, well, it's got all the capacity I need.
If you'd rather spend money on your home than on your home insurance, call Eagle Star Direct now on 0800 333 800.
The Watson family live in the shadow of breast cancer. Now a genetic test can predict who is at risk, but scientific advances bring difficult choices.
I could, go and have a mastectomy, I could have a hysterectomy, and then I could get run over by a bus.
Should they have the test, and what if it's positive? The decision tonight at 9 on 4. Now the latest Channel 4 news with Jon Snow and Daljit Dhaliwal. The time coming up to 7 o'clock.
A date for all-party talks on Northern Ireland, an unexpected move to get peace back on track. Good evening. An hour from now, John Major will talk by phone with his Irish counterpart, John Bruton. If all goes well, Mr. Bruton will then fly to London tomorrow morning to seal an agreement for all-party talks on peace in Northern Ireland on a specified date. The conditions for Sinn Féin's participation will be spelt out. But at the same time, the government's relations with David Trimble's Ulster Unionists have hit a new low in the aftermath of last night's farrago of allegation and counter-allegation amid the panic of the Scott vote. Tonight we report developments and debate the mechanics. Also tonight, to be young, Irish and in London with no IRA ceasefire in place. Paranoia, prejudice and fear. The price of not talking. And falling from a great height, the once odds-on winner of Australia's general election. From Sydney, what happens when parties close the ideological divide? Is a vote for Labour a vote for the Conservatives?
And the other news headlines tonight, an operation to crack down on mobile phone theft and fraud has been launched by the police and the phone industry. Mobile phone operators say they lose more than 100 million a year in what's becoming one of Britain's fastest growing crimes. Fire brigade chief officers have written to every station in the country urging firefighters to lobby their MPs over cuts in funding. They say jobs are being lost and stations closing. And at least 15 people have been killed and dozens of others injured in a motorway pile-up in Belgium.
A summit meeting in the renewed drive for peace in Northern Ireland is likely to take place between John Major and the Irish Prime Minister John Bruton in London tomorrow. This came as Mr Major today ruled out any deals with unionist parties to keep his government in office, if they might affect the peace process. It's also become clear that the British government is about to fix a date for all-party talks. In a day of fast-moving developments, as our political editor Eleanor Goodman reports, last night's close shave for the government over the Scott report has already been put behind it.
Today the Cabinet tried to pick up the pieces after last night's vote. In the longer term, they will have to try to rebuild their reputation for integrity, but in the short term, their priority was showing that the Northern Ireland peace process was above squalid party politics and that London and Dublin can move forward together. And in some ways, that has been made easier by the Prime Minister's much vaunted refusal to do a deal with the Unionists last night, for it made his talks with the nationalist SDLP easier. Like Dublin, they believe the only hope of getting Sinn Féin to declare another ceasefire is to set a firm date for all-party negotiations. And today, despite unionist opposition to a date, Mr Hume seemed hopeful.
We're very pleased that the Prime Minister has made it very clear that his objective is to set a very firm date for all-party talks and negotiations. And what he's working at the moment in talking to ourselves, the other parties and the Irish government, is creating the means whereby we can arrive at that date and arrive at those all-party negotiations.
The package which Mr Hume will now have to try to sell to Gerry Adams seems to be made up of Bosnian-style proximity talks, roughly as proposed by Dublin, followed by elections and possibly a simultaneous referendum, leading directly to all-party talks. This afternoon, Mr Major was trying to sell the idea to the Democratic Ulster Unionist Dr Paisley, as officials tried to agree a form of wording with Dublin which would allow the two Prime Ministers to meet tomorrow. At Westminster, Mr Blair is maintaining his support for the peace process, but he wanted to reinforce the idea today of a government that would do anything to hang on to power.
In view of the damaging speculation, can he clarify whether any deal was offered to the government last night, as has been suggested, or not?
There is no deal with any political party in this House. No deal with any political party in this House. Not with the DUP, not with the Ulster Unionists, not with the SDLP. No deal, not now, not yesterday, not tomorrow, not at all on this process.
Today, the Unionist leader, David Trimble, was doing the rounds of TV studios, furious at the way the Tories were making it look as if the government had spurned his party's offer of a deal. Despite a diary full of meeting with ministers yesterday, he denied any link between the vote on Scott and the peace process. At 6 o'clock, Mr Trimble met Mr Major, who was accompanied by the Chief Whip, Alistair Goodlad, but not the Northern Ireland Secretary, Sir Patrick Mayhew. Mr Major tried to reassure Mr Trimble he hadn't done a deal with the Democratic Unionists. At around 6:30, Mr Trimble reported back to his own MPs, who agreed they would almost certainly vote against the government. Just after 7, the Unionist Chief Whip met his Conservative opposite number and the Northern Ireland Minister, Michael Ancram. At around 8:30, Mr Trimble met Brian Mulwiney, the Tory party chairman, and himself an Ulsterman in the tea room, who suggested he had another meeting with the Prime Minister. So at about 9 o'clock, Mr Trimble met the Prime Minister again, who this time was accompanied by the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine. Both sides agree that at these meetings Mr Major insisted that no deals were on offer. Where they strongly differ is over what the unionists were offering. As the sick MPs were taken away from Westminster last night, rumours were circulating in the scrum, seemingly emanating from ministers, that the unionists had offered a deal, their votes in support for the government for the next 12 months, in return for the electoral system they want for the proposed peace forum. Today's papers quoted Sir Patrick Mayhew as being furious and rejecting all clandestine deals, a view endorsed by the former Northern Ireland Minister Michael Mates, who is still close to the Northern Ireland office and presumably thought he was being helpful.
The vote was on Scott. I doubt whether any of the conversations were about Scott. It's quite clear that they were about other matters, and the Unionist Party were trying to use their political muscle to get their way. And John Major stood firm and said, I am not going to play party politics with the Northern Ireland peace process.
But Mr Trimble insisted he had not tried to get a deal.
Categorically no. No words of any nature relating to that passed my lips last night at all. The meetings took place at the government's request because the government knew that we were concerned, for matters wholly unconnected with Scott, about rumours that they had done a deal with the Democratic Unionist Party.
Mr Heseltine, who was at the second meeting, gave a version of events which squared with either interpretation, seemingly aimed mainly at making the Prime Minister look tough.
I've made the position absolutely clear. There was no deal. Indeed, the meeting that I was at with the Prime Minister, which was about 9 o'clock last night, the point that he made to Mr Trimble very, very clearly is that no deal had been done with Dr Paisley, and no deal could be done with the Ulster Unionists.
The ayes to the right, 390. The noes to the left, 320.
Yeah. Last night the government won, by just one, despite the unionists being in the opposition lobby. But the government could still probably rely on their support if it came to a confidence motion.
On the Scott issue, we were dealing with a specific issue where there are certain specific matters which go right to the relationship in Westminster, in Parliament, between ministers and Parliament. It's obviously very important to us. And that was a specific issue. A matter of confidence is a general issue where you're looking at the government as a whole, and you have to decide whether you want to turn the government out or not. And we would have probably taken a different view on that, and we probably still would take a different view on that.
A few minutes ago, Dr Paisley emerged from Downing Street, apparently dampening hopes of a breakthrough in the peace process. But Mr Major is due to speak to the Irish Prime Minister later this evening in the hope of arranging a summit for tomorrow. Eleanor Goodman, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, Mr Paisley is even now as we speak on our way to our Westminster studio. I hope he'll join us in a few moments, but in the meantime the Deputy Leader of the Ulster Unionists, John Taylor, joins us. John Taylor, what do you think is happening between the Ulster Unionists and the government?
Well, we've had an ongoing series of meetings with the Prime Minister, and we've nearly reached the end of the road in that.
What does that mean precisely?
Well, I think we've reached the stage where the Prime Minister should be able to go ahead with his summit meeting with the Southern Irish Prime Minister, and hopefully we will then get the Southern Irish at last, after 6 months of delaying tactics, to agree to an electoral process in Northern Ireland which will get the whole political process on the move again.
What about this specified date for all-party talks?
Well, what we want first of all is an election as quickly as possible, no further delaying tactics. We could have a referendum the same day. I would like to see this happening in April or May at the very latest, so that the Peace Convention could then meet in May or June. And of course the first item on the agenda there must be to establish the credentials of all those parties that get elected to this Peace Convention. The Mitchell report, which was welcomed by Dublin and by the SDLP and by the nationalist community generally, and is supported by the Ulster Unionists, would be the basis of clarifying the position of the parties who are elected. And if they're all prepared to comply with the 6 principles laid down by Senator Mitchell about decommissioning, we can move straight ahead into all-party talks.
So let's just get this straight. You would say that from tomorrow we should learn, 1, what sort of electoral system is going to be used, 2, when those elections are going to be, and 3, the date of all-party talks that will follow those elections.
I think the actual date for all-party talks is very difficult to define, because that depends upon all parties that get elected to the Peace Convention agreeing to the implementation of the Mitchell report. Some of them might drag their feet on that issue. Certainly we in the Ulster Unionist Party will not. We will welcome the Mitchell report.
But the way to prevent foot dragging, as you put it, is surely to impose a date.
Yes, of course it is. But what if some of the parties don't comply with the issue of decommissioning? We couldn't enter into talks with people who are going to say we are going to retain our bombs and our bullets and let off more bombs on Canary Wharf if you don't do as we tell you.
Though Mitchell does allow for decommissioning to occur as the talking goes on.
Oh, absolutely, and we agree to that.
Right.
Oh yes, the Ulster Unionists have agreed to staged decommissioning, phased decommissioning as the talks proceed.
Now tonight, are you resigned to the fact that the electoral system will probably be the one that favours the SDLP and Dr Paisley's DUP?
Well, we know why they want that. That's to maximise their support and to eliminate some of the smaller parties.
But are you resigned to it?
Not resigned to it. I would thought people generally wanted all-party talks. It seems very odd that Mr. Paisley and Mr. Hume are now conniving together to deny all parties the right to be elected to the Peace Convention.
But in a word, do you think it is that system, the one-unit system that's used for the European elections, that is going to prevail?
No, I think it's still touch and go whether we're going to have a fair electoral system on the basis of the single transferable vote based on constituencies. That would ensure the proper representation of the Alliance Party and some representation from the paramilitary parties. If we go for the Northern Ireland electoral system that's now been suggested by Mr. Paisley and Mr. Hume, well then I'm afraid the Alliance Party will be reduced considerably and the Loyalist paramilitary parties will be excluded, and so you will no longer have all party talks.
John Taylor, thank you very much for joining us, and as I said, we hope very much that Dr. Paisley will be with us in just a few moments. The Prime Minister also today told the Commons that he welcomed Labour's plans to drop its long-standing opposition to the government's anti-terrorist laws. The Shadow Home Secretary Jack Straw made it clear at the weekend that, for the first time in 15 years, Labour would abstain on a renewal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But many of the Irish community in Britain fear a threat to their civil liberties by this new cross-party alliance. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Rory McLean, assesses the emotions amongst the Irish in London as security measures are tightened in the city.
At the Galtimore Ballroom in northwest London, the annual Irish Music Awards are an expression of a pride that many people who've lived in England for most of their lives feel for their heritage. A chance to forget about everything except an evening's entertainment. But concerns about the future and how peace can be regained are not that far from the surface.
You've got to get them together again and talk. No matter what happens, they must be together talking. When they're talking, at least there's something going on. There's nothing going on when they're not talking.
I think they must talk at any cost, honestly. I think there is no other chance.
We've had enough of Jerry Adams and his gang. We don't want any more of them.
Now, why do you think that?
He's only for himself. He has nothing to offer anybody in Ireland or even any Irishman that's here.
There are also some worries about the effects on Irish communities if the bombing continues in London and elsewhere.
There's a feeling of apprehension that in a situation where bombs are going off, if you have an Irish accent, you're inclined to be apprehensive. I think there's a sense, too, in which, if one's stopped by the police for whatever reason, there is a tendency, however well-founded suspicions and well-founded may or may not be, to be actually dragged in and questioned because one merely has an Irish accent.
Although many feel attitudes to the Irish have improved since the 70s, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is due to be renewed next month, is still an emotive issue because of the number of people, as with the recent bus bombing, who are arrested under it and then released without charge. Conor Foley was detained and released under the Act some time ago. He had been an active member of the campaign protesting the innocence of the Guildford Four, who were later freed.
I see in the context of the terrorist campaign and the renewal of the terrorist campaign why measures are needed to combat terrorism, and clearly the police do need to have those powers, and there's been tragic events which people obviously would want to see prevented. But the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a misnamed piece of legislation. There's no evidence that it has actually prevented terrorism. Of the thousands of people who have been arrested in this country under the Act, only about 3 or 4% have ever been charged with anything remotely resembling terrorism, which either means that thousands of suspected terrorists are allowed to walk out of police custody, or that the Act has been misused.
A recent survey shows that 56% of Irish people in this country vote Labour, which says it's dropped its opposition to the Prevention of Terrorism Act because the government has promised a review of the workings of the Act. And at this Irish centre, there's a feeling that overall politicians need to address the real issues.
The one time in history, if ever we had a chance for real peace, it's now. And people just let it drag on, and they never done anything constructive about it. And I think, in a way, people are angry with their politicians for at least not coming to grips with this and taking the opportunity for peace.
So you don't think they're serious about stopping them?
What difference does it make if they stop or not, Ian? They won't be going anywhere.
The Soldier's Song is a play which was commissioned for production at the time of the ceasefire, and whose plot of a young man who dies on a mission for the IRA has been overtaken by real events.
Certainly since the ceasefire broke down, I've become more
aware and more conscious of my accent and the effect that it has on people. And when they hear it, and you feel like people are looking at you.
The play looks at the effects of the Troubles on a family, and there's no doubt Irish families living away from home hope tomorrow's expected summit will start the peace process all over again.
Rory McLean. After the break, a full news summary and weather forecast, plus the war crimes trial begins of one of the most wanted men in former Yugoslavia. Can a plan for random checks on mobile phone dealers cut down on the multi-million-pound cost to customers of theft and fraud? And fire brigade chiefs launch a campaign to halt cuts in spending which they say will cost lives.
The Dean of St Dunstan's has dealt with all his regular bills with DD and can now dole out his disposable dosh to the deserving.
Drinks are on me!
I wanted a car with loads of space. Well, you have to, when you've got so many little monkeys.
Excuse me, Sir Brian. Got the present, sir? Of course, Bob. Enough in the whip round, then? £75 and 14p. 14p? You put that in? I don't suppose you bought it with your...
With my Barclay card? Oh, yes, obviously, Boff. I had a manila envelope stuffed with cash, and so naturally, I used Barclay card.
Well, it would have been insured against loss or damage.
Boff! This is the wedding of the daughter of the head of MI7. There are 4 men on the roof, 2 in the choir, and the vicar has no previous convictions. I think that's ample insurance for a china teapot.
Something extraordinary is happening. Esso are looking at all the fuel prices in your neighborhood. And although we will never compromise the outstanding performance of all our fuels, we will ensure our own prices are among the lowest around. Look out for the new Esso Price Watch, the dawn of a new era in motoring.
Daisy, from the Devon Dairy, doesn't use direct debit. Silly cow. Dee, how the discerning deal with their dough.
For more information on the Skoda Felicia, call 0345 745 745 now.
A scheme aimed at cracking down on one of the fastest growing crimes in Britain, the theft of mobile phones, has been launched today. It is a joint operation between the Home Office and the mobile phone industry, which says it is losing more than £100 million a year through theft and fraud. Mobile phone operators and the police are now to run joint random checks on Britain's 10,000 dealers to try to catch those who trade in stolen phones. Mark Dyson reports on how a mushrooming industry has generated a plethora of electronic crime.
2 officers of a new private police force on the beat. Their mission to clean up the mobile phone industry. Much of their work is undercover, so we can't show their faces.
How do you do? Perhaps you just want to look at our identity.
Any phone dealer in the country can now expect a visit from the Crime Prevention Inspectorate. That's what they call themselves. They're looking for stolen mobile phones or any evidence of fraud. This dealer's records show everything is in order, but even honest dealers know there are many in the industry who are corrupt.
Well, I think one of the problems has been is that it's so easy for people to get into the business, and obviously the general public see that they're just opening up all over the place and they have no real business qualifications.
The result? Crooked dealers selling stolen phones, stolen to order. 500 are stolen every day in Britain, often from parked cars. But that's often just the beginning of what can become a serious, organised crime racket. Once stolen, the mobiles can be reprogrammed with another phone's identity. It becomes a cloned phone. Calls, typically running into thousands of pounds, can be made on someone else's bill. Police have found rooms full of cloned phones. These are all live, making calls around the world, all operated remotely from another location. This amounts to an automatic telephone exchange. Mobile phone crime can be very sophisticated, and it's international. Because many of the phones stolen in Britain will end up in places like Hong Kong and China, both with similar cellular networks. Unscrupulous dealers in the back streets of Hong Kong will reprogram them. And as Channel 4 News revealed last year, phones that are cloned and thus almost untraceable are the favourite means of communication for criminals to facilitate their international dealings. No wonder the Home Secretary was convinced today of the need to stamp out mobile crime, even though his preferred solution is the phone industry policing itself.
The basis of the operation is a clause in the contract between the dealers and the suppliers, the networks, and if an inspector discovers that a dealer has not been operating as he should have been operating, that dealer will effectively be put out of business.
We've had to have the express sanction of the Office of Fair Trading because it could be viewed as a monopolistic or anti-competitive venture that we're getting into. It has been properly registered with the Office of Fair Trading, and we're receiving support not only from the Home Office, but in fact from the Department of Trade and Industry.
Last October, Trade Minister Ian Taylor accepted the urgent need for new laws to combat mobile phone fraud, because English law is currently incapable of dealing with techniques like cloning or the operation of electronic scanners like this, which can pluck mobile phone identities out of the air. The deal was the law would change if the phone industry put its own house in order. Now the industry has introduced its own police force. It's impatient for more help from the government.
We believe that the changes in the acts which have been mentioned today need to be brought through, because we've got to give the police something more to work with, and therefore we need that in association with our own initiative to try and protect the public.
The next stage is to train British police in the same way as police in the United States already have been, to spot stolen and cloned phones. An industry-led global task force is also being built up to clamp down on the international side of these crimes. But the fear in this country is that unless the government moves faster, mobile phone crime here could go the way of America, where it's become endemic and violent.
Mark Dyson. Now, fire brigade chief officers have written to every station in the country urging firefighters to lobby their MPs against cuts in funding. The officers say they are angry that recent constraints are resulting in job losses and forcing some stations to close. In North Yorkshire, the fire brigade has lost almost a third of its part-time officers who form the core of the area's rural service. Steve Smith reports on why fire service chiefs have mounted their campaign against cuts they say could threaten the public's safety.
Tony Carrington holds down 3 jobs. At 6:30 he does a postal round. By mid-morning he's cleaning windows. And at any time of day he's on call as a part-time firefighter. That takes precedence over everything. Tony's one of 11 part-time or retained firefighters in the North Yorkshire village of Somerbridge. This brigade turns out for fires and traffic accidents up to 24 miles away. Retained crews are the core of the fire service in rural areas like this. With 5 years' experience, Tony receives £1,600 a year from the fire service. There's another £10 for training nights and £11 for a call-out such as this.